Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Now, cash-strapped consumers breathed a sigh of relief this week when the fuel price went down. However, experts are warning that despite this slight reprieve, daily expenses in South Africa are likely to keep rising. For some advice on how to stay debt-free, I'm joined by Annaline Van Der Poel from Debt Rescue. A very good evening to you, Annaline. Thank you so much for your time. Perhaps let's start off with some of the factors that may have influenced the June petrol and diesel price cuts.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Well, I think probably the biggest one that's been the biggest contributor has been the fact that the oil price has been, quite a bit lower than expected. The rand exchange rate to the dollar has obviously fluctuated quite significantly. So, biggest contributor has come from the oil price.
And while it's good news for motorists, I mean, it's a sizable drop in petrol and diesel prices. The good news will seemingly be short-lived because on that one hand, motorists are being cautioned by analysts and others in the know to keep an eye and even tighter handles on their finances and also prepare for more increases in the months to come.
Indeed. Over the previous weekend, we saw that OPEC had met and Saudi Arabia had indicated that they're going to be reducing their, output by about 1 million barrels per day, which means that, their clear intent is that they want to get the oil price up again. So they're going to be lowering supply. And the indication is that they were actually looking at getting the oil price up to about $100 a barrel. So that is most definitely going to, see an increase in the oil price, meaning the fuel price again, which means that the petrol pumps, especially with our exchange rate currently sitting where it is, that we're most likely going to be seeing increases coming through again.
Yeah. And why do you believe perhaps, the impact of the increases will be felt so much, especially looking at the potential for a humanitarian crisis for the country?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that, there's multiple impacts that we see when the fuel price goes up. So obviously, first and foremost, you feel it immediately in your pocket directly, when it comes to transport, whether it's filling up your own vehicle, making use of any form of transport. There you will see in the future, if it goes up again, we'll see the increases. Hopefully, seeing some decreases right now. But the indirect impact of fuel price increases, comes from, for example, the transport of goods. As we know, the majority of our goods are transported by road in South Africa, which thus means that, as the, for example, diesel price goes up, that is going to affect the cost of those goods being transported, meaning it's going to hit our pockets. And the other one, and especially, over the last couple of months where we've seen dramatic, impact of load shedding. For example, our farmers, they have had to, obviously, find solutions in their own environments as well, to try and make sure that their manufacturing and production, et cetera, continues, and turning, for example, to generators and so forth, which again is using diesel. So invariably, as a consumer, we are seeing the impact on our pockets because of factors beyond just the direct impact.
Yeah. So food inflation in South Africa raced to a 14-year peak in March this year, coming in at a whopping 14%. So you're saying that the petrol price is essentially increasing, and that increases and influences the price of foods.
Indeed, absolutely. It's inevitable. I mean, like I said, we've got the direct, but the indirect, anything where, and like I say, big contributor right now is load shedding, because obviously so many manufacturing facilities have had to find and invest in alternative sources, of electricity. And whether this be solar, that's a massive cost layout, or whether they've turned to generators where they need to then, of course, again, use, diesel or petrol to run these things. It's additional input costs on their side, which is pushing up prices for us as consumers.
So I know you in your space seeing more and more people across the income spectrum turning to credit to get through the month, which shows that there's a lot of defaulting when it comes to debt. What would your advice be for South Africans who are taking on debt to put food on the table each month? How can they get themselves out of this debt trap?
I'm going to say I don't want to use the word budgeting, because I think right now most people want to run the opposite direction when we start talking about that. So I'm going to use planning. We need to plan. We really, really need to plan. every part of how we spend our money, where every single cent goes. Before we buy anything, make sure that we are researching, looking at all our options. Go back to your bank statement, see if you've got some expenses going off there that perhaps you can revise, completely cancel if you're no longer using it, and so forth. But most importantly, remembering that the National Credit Act in 2007 made provision specifically for circumstances where consumers are over indebted, to provide them with legal protection and provide them with a method in which they can repay their debt at lowered installments over a longer period of time, thereby honoring their debt, preventing legal action, still repaying it, but in a more affordable manner. Because right now, the reality is most consumers have the intention of actually repaying their debt. They're just unable to do so. We know the interest rate hikes have placed a massive burden on their repayment ability, along with putting on the other side the impact of inflation on living expenses. So first and foremost, have a look at what your financial circumstances are, get an understanding where your opportunities are to potentially make some changes as well. But if you've done that, seek help from a debt counselor. Let them help restructure your debt in a manner whereby you don't have to incur further debt every single month, over and above the debt you already have, just to make sure you put food on the table.
Yeah. I mean, are there no, is there no negative impact looking at what could essentially come out as debt review, being placed under debt review? Is that as good as it sounds, or does it come back to bite a little later on?
I think it's really important to remember that there's no quick fix to a situation where you're over indebted. This is a process, and it takes commitment. So hoping that this is something that's going to, in essence, be a solution that will just, be a magic wand. That's not what this is. Debt review is a process whereby you enter into, you repay your debt, lowered installments, longer period of time, but in a manner whereby your budget, in other words, you're able to afford your living expenses, because all those provisions are made in your budget. The only negative is that during this period you cannot apply for further credit, but the whole point thereof is you're already over indebted. So going into further debt or applying for further credit is just putting you into a spiral. So it's really important to understand that it is a process, it does take time, and it does take commitment, but it's an incredibly successful one. There are thousands of consumers being rehabilitated monthly, in this industry, successfully re-entering the credit market. I know that's one of the big fears is, will I ever be able to get debt again? Absolutely, you can. We have many consumers who re-enter the credit market not long after applying for loans, vehicles, home loans, and the likes. So it's absolutely possible to rehabilitate and re-enter the credit markets again.
And what does the rehabilitation process essentially entail? Looking at someone who's asked themselves a few questions and thought perhaps debt review is the solution. What does the process entail?
So the process is an administrative one and a legal one at the end of the day, meaning that you are renegotiating on original contractual agreements. So, in the fact that you are reducing the monthly repayment amount and extending the repayment term. But rehabilitation means you're repaying the debt, and once the debt is repaid, you are issued with what's called a clearance certificate. That clearance certificate is then provided to all your credit providers, confirming your debt has been paid up, as well as the credit bureaus. And, once that's issued, you can re-enter into the credit markets and become credit active again, but without the burden of debt that you entered into originally.
Yeah. And perhaps very lastly, I mean, earlier you spoke about going off using the word budget and opting to call it planning. That plan, in terms of looking at the breakdown of the certain percentages, what questions should consumers be asking?
Well, I think it's really important to be very, very truthful with yourself when it comes to your planning or budgeting, as we call it. Take those bank statements and really look at them honestly. If you, for example, I usually say it's very simple. Split your budget into two sections. On one side, you have your expenses, and the other side, you have your debts. Your debt is obviously the minimum repayments you have to make every single month. So those are pretty simple to work out. But when it comes to your expense side, is looking at your bank statements and going, How much do I need every month, for example, for electricity? How much do I need for food? And see if that is really what you're spending. Because realistically, we know fuel has gone up. Even though it's come down currently, it's still significantly higher than it was a year ago. Food prices have gone up exponentially. Electricity prices have gone up. So if you put an amount there, be realistic and go, is this really what I spend? And if you, for example, are spending more, is there an opportunity to reduce it? But it is quite an honest check with yourself to see if I've taken all of my expenses, my living expenses, my rent, my food, school fees, insurances, cell phones, etc. If I deduct that amount from my income and what is remaining, is that enough to cover the minimum debt repayment installments? And if it isn't, that is your assessment of whether you're over-indebted or not. Yeah. So if you've made those changes to your living expenses, that is a very, very good indicator of where your financial situation is.
Absolutely. Some sound advice indeed. Thank you very much. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Some food for thought. Annaline Van Der Poel from Debt Rescue.